Hi there, this is John Barbour. It's November 22nd, 2023. 60 years ago, elements of our government murdered our president, John F. Kennedy. Jim Garrison said this very passionately on The Tonight Show. And sadly, it's also a week of Thanksgiving. But I have nothing to give thanks to. I can thank nobody in the assassination community whatsoever, because not one of them has the balls or the courage to go to Washington, D.C. and open that cold case which was placed there by the House Select Committee and solved by Jim Garrison. You know, during my career, it seems, I have become accidentally involved with Mr. Garrison. And it began in 1970, and it continues up to this day. I have lost two of the greatest shows in the history of television, and in that span of time, I have spent over $500,000. And do I have any regrets? Absolutely not. Because when you are tossed away by two of the worst human beings as parents when you're 6 years of age, there is nobody that can hurt you that much. I am a little bit saddened because this is the last time that ever am I going to be talking to you about John Kennedy, because John Kennedy is dead, he is ancient history, and he is of no more importance to this country. Nobody cares about him any longer. And a man that people should be caring about is the one who is more important than he is, and that is Jim Garrison. And John Kennedy, if he were alive, would be the first to say that, quoting Thomas Jefferson, his idol, because Jim Garrison was the only law enforcement officer, the only district attorney with the constitutional balls to prove that nobody should be above the law. And when I interviewed Mr. Garrison on September 5th, 1981, I asked him, Mr. Garrison, whatever made you think you could take on the federal government? And he smiled and he said, John, I guess as a kid I saw one too many Frank Capra movies. Well, that was like me. I mean, I fell in love with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Wow, when Jimmy Stewart was filibustering against Claude Rains, the crook, I just loved it. What great theater. And, oh my God, I wanted to be in a country where there was that kind of freedom of speech. And so at 17, I came down here illegally before I was deported to become a gambler, actually. But when I became a film critic and looked at that movie again, I realized Jimmy Stewart did not win. It was like a bad Perry Mason movie where Claude Rains jumps up and he says, oh, I'm guilty. It was just god awful. So what I wanted to do was first write all this up, sort of like a one-man show with 3 acts. And the first part of the first act would be talking about John Kennedy, Jim Garrison, the country past and present. In the middle would be the story about this great disappointment. And at the end, I'd be going to Scotland to rediscover my father and discover more of Jim Garrison's favorite writer, who was William Shakespeare. But instead of writing it down, I really want to talk to you just off the cuff. So to paraphrase Lady Macbeth, screw your courage to the sticking point. So I'm going to screw my tongue to my heart, and let's just see what pops out. And I hope you have the patience and the interest to listen. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. that, of course, is Howard Beale screaming at America 50 years ago about how degenerate America's become from top to bottom. It is absolutely, totally brilliant. Paddy Chayefsky at his best. The only movie ever made in America that I said people would go to listen to rather than look at. But here also is Chayefsky's genius. Because if you say, I'm not going to take it anymore, there's going to be an added line, and this is what I'm going to do about it. But Chayefsky was smart enough to know that after they murdered John Kennedy and then they destroyed Jim Garrison, there was nothing that anybody could do about it. And as Jim Garrison said to me, John, if the public and the people don't do anything about the murder of John Kennedy, they're going to realize that not even the President of the United States runs the country. But there's an additional genius in that movie that I've never heard anyone talk about much. And that is he points out how money rules the universe. Ned Beatty calls Peter Finch in, sits him down at the end of the table and points at him and yells at him. And he says, Mr. Beale, there are no more countries. There are only corporations. And then he goes on to name a half a dozen corporations that we're aware of. I mean, wow, there's some real truth there. And then he said, there are only dollars, there are only rubles, there are only shekels, there are only Deutschmark. And you, Mr. Beale, are interfering with the natural rules of the universe. Well, my God, this is cloak and dagger under the cover. Karl Marx. It is so unbelievably brilliant. Or that Jim Garrison said, I thought I was living in the country I was born in. So there's just one little fact that we can point out to you that says he's absolutely right about how it's changed. Julian Assange pointed out to us the criminal war crimes committed by our banker military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about in 1960. And he had to flee the country. And then you had Ed Snowden telling us how we are being watched every single second by the security state, and we have been reduced only to numbers. Numbers on our social security card, numbers on our credit card, numbers on our license plates, numbers on our driver's license, numbers on our birth certificate. That we are not citizens, we are only consumers. And in the film I say that these two guys had to run for their life. Truth tellers have to run for their lives, while liars run for office. And neither Biden or Trump had the balls to pardon them. And yet, in the 1970s, with the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg is made a national hero. There are no more heroes in this country. A friend of mine in Canada says up there in Canada they feel that they're living over a meth lab. When I came down here in the 50s, there were 50 famous Americans from all walks of life, all stripes, religious or political, that you could admire and applaud and want to be like because they were so inspirational, all the way from the Supreme Court down to radio with Paul Harvey, and now the rest of the story. Adlai Stevenson, the only intellect to be running for the presidency since John Kennedy. And on the conservative side, there was Barry no-nonsense Goldwater, who couldn't even get into the party today. On television, every week, I never missed the king of comedy, and that was Milton Berle. And yet, he was bumped out of the first spot into second place by a Catholic archbishop, Fulton Sheen. And I still watched him, even though I was an agnostic, because I loved listening to the stories he told about the Bible. I loved the stories and I loved the words. Most of all, my biggest love, the man who inspired me to get into this business, was the best host by far of The Tonight Show. And that was the one of a kind, Jack Paar. And then on the intellectual side of talk shows, there was David Susskind in Open End. And the most entertaining part of elections at that time was just a wonderful meeting of like two titans of intellect. They were like mountain goats in heat, butting heads on television. And that was William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal. It was thrilling television and thrilling information. Gore Vidal was the one who said this country's Bill of Rights and Constitution was written by a handful of the brightest men in American history, and we haven't seen them since. And so, who do we have butting empty heads now? Beavis and Butthead. And if you're voting for Joe Biden, you're sailing on the Titanic. And if you're voting for Donald Trump, you're flying in the Hindenburg, and he has just gone down in flames, and thousands of idiots are buying mugs to help get legal extinguishers for the fires. And then, worse than that, though, to me, is that almost everyone in the Senate on the left, everyone in the Congress, and most of the talking heads on television, and most of them on the internet, are all running around screaming, "Nobody is above the law." Well, that is the biggest crock of shit in American history. So much shit, it could overflow the Grand Canyon. Because when Jim Garrison solved the case in 1967 and went on television, "I have solved the case," every single aspect of law, every single entity in the media, everyone in a position to break the law, broke the law to destroy Jim Garrison's case and destroy his office and destroy the man. They were only partially successful in destroying his case because he won the most important part of it, and that was the perjury case. But they did destroy his office. But they will never, ever destroy his memory, which we are going to try to preserve and creating a scholarship for him at Tulane University. When I look at those people, those CEOs and those members of Congress and those people on the internet and those people on the media who are saying nobody is above the law, I look at them and I think every single one of them should have a fucking mugshot. When I came to this country, it was like a lighthouse of hope. Now I feel like I'm living in a whorehouse where every one of the hookers has AIDS. We have become what Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union, the evil empire. And if you don't see that, you're looking at us through Helen Keller's eyes. Over 100 years ago, in one of our first fake wars, when we murdered 200,000 Filipinos, Mark Twain said, "The Stars and Stripes should be changed to the Jolly Roger, the flag of pirates." And I believe if George Carlin and Bill Hicks were still alive, they'd be looking at the Statue of Liberty and saying, "Hey, lady, you better blow out that candle and kiss your ass goodbye and this country goodbye." And then they go down to the bottom and look at the part that says, "Oh, give me your poor and huddled masses." Oh, no, that's enough. We're creating hundreds of thousands of those. Not only Are we creating hundreds of thousands of homeless? Worse than that, we are creating multi-millions of voiceless. And that's each and every one of us, because we have absolutely nothing to say about how this country is run and ruined. In 1968, Martin Luther King was putting together a 1 million poor persons march on Washington, D.C. And the intent of it was to shut down that fake Vietnam War, and with the treasury that was saved, to distribute that money equitably among the citizens. He was trying to make a change. Mark Twain said politicians are like diapers. They need to be changed often, and for the same reason. But we do not need a poor person's march on Washington. We need a real person's march on Washington, because we do not need to change politicians. We need to change this criminal, corrupt system from top to bottom. And you do it not by marching on the White House. It's by making it America's Bastille Day on the Justice Department. Because everything that went wrong with America began with the murder of John Kennedy and is in the Justice Department as a cold case. And you open that Pandora's box and you will find the cure that will bring back a constitutional democracy to this country. But I know of no one, just a handful, but no one in this so-called assassination community, the big shots in it, who have the balls to do anything like that, that gather thousands of people together, which they could do. They avoid it at all costs. I only know 2 people who were silly enough to do such an absurd thing. And one of them is talking to you. And the other one was one of my dearest friends, one of the best lawyers I ever known. And that was Brian Lloyd, who sadly died about a year ago. But 5 years ago, I started to make the American media film because I was cheated out of hundreds of thousands of dollars with the first film, so there was no money left over to start any kind of scholarship for Jim. I get a call from Brian Lloyd, and he said, John, from the time I was 16 years of age, I've been saving everything about the assassination, books and newspaper magazines, films, everything. I have a locker full of them, and I'll be happy to send them to you. He put them in a U-Haul, sent them to me, and a lot of that fantastic information went into this remarkable, historic film. So anyway, with the encouragement of Jim Garris from years and years ago, when I asked him at one time if he were the district attorney, who would he arrest? And he gave me a list of 10 people. Well, half of them were still alive. So we put it on a 10 most wanted list, and we marched to the Justice Department. Now we get there, and it's surrounded by cops. And I'm really, really nervous because for 20 years I had a lot of trouble with cops. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back, okay, because I had committed myself to doing this. But I turned to Brian, and I said, Brian, you don't have to do this. You don't have to stay. And he pointed to the front of his T-shirt, and he said, John, the truth is bulletproof. I mean, that's almost poetic. And then he adds, he said, in case they arrest you, you're going to need somebody to keep you company in jail, or you're going to need a very good lawyer. And I'm a very good lawyer, and besides, I have my camera here, and I can film it. And so he indeed filmed it. I cannot tell you how much I miss people like Brian Lloyd and Jim Garrison. The first time I met Jim Garrison, or rather the first time I got to speak to him, was quite by accident. Brad Lockman, the producer of the new AM show in Los Angeles on ABC, had hired me to be the host and chose me over a bunch of more qualified news people, which is amazing, because here I am a week earlier, this struggling comic, and now I'm talking to giants. Here is Muhammad Ali talking passionately against that cruel, fake war in Vietnam, something that I could not do then because of the Fairness Doctrine. And now here is Governor Reagan talking passionately for that Vietnam fake war. And a few years later, when he became president, one of the first things he did was destroy and trash the Fairness Doctrine. In all fairness, I had little or no interest in John Kennedy's murder, and even less interest in Jim Garrison. My only interest was in trying to do the best job I could as a host of this show and be the best father I could to my 12-month-old son, Christopher. Of course, I took interest in the case because it was all over the news, and because it was a bestseller, I did pick up Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, and I read it. And I was stunned at how magnificently it disemboweled the Warren Report and the Warren Commission. And I just thought, wow, when all these lawyers in Washington and New York get to read it, they will disembowel the Justice Department, the media, the FBI, and the CIA, and Jim Garrison may get on with his case. So here I was, hired to do this show. And when Brad hired me, he took me in to see John McMahon, who was a general manager, wearing a $600 Brooks Brothers empty suit. And Mr. McMahon says to me, well, John, what do you think it is that you can do that would bring an audience to this morning news show? And I said, well, John, he said, Mr. McMahon. I said, well, Mr. McMahon, we live in Hollywood where they make movies, and I would like people to know that there's somebody at home sitting in this chair, so I'd like to do movie reviews. You will not do movie reviews. Nobody cares. It's only television now. So what else do you have in mind? And I said, well, I would like to do open phones because often I found that viewers can ask better questions than the host. And he said, well, first of all, nobody in Los Angeles is smart enough to answer a phone call. And secondly, why did we hire you? So I stared at him, and then I said, Mr. McMahon, hopefully you will find out in a week or two and give Brad a raise. Brad took me back to the office, smiling, put his arm around my shoulder. He said, John, you do absolutely anything you want because we're going to be live, and I think you're going to be fantastic. So, being live, I did the reviews. Being live, we did open phone calls. They became the two most popular elements in the show. The show got absolutely rave reviews in Variety and in the Hollywood Reporter. And the film reviews were so popular that I was called by Los Angeles Magazine to replace Bert Proletsky, their brilliant critic who was going on to Los Angeles Times to do a column. And Bert wrote one of the funniest one-line reviews I ever read, and he was also the one who recommended me after watching my reviews. He said, Dick Van Dyke's Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, it starts out with a bang and ends up chitty. So, anyway, a couple of weeks later, we're bumping heads with the Today Show, and the FCC Commissioner, Nicholas Johnson, the youngest in history, comes on the show to talk about his book, How to Talk Back to Television. Afterwards, he sends a letter to Leonard Goldenson at ABC saying, you have the brightest, the most charming, the most gracious, and the smartest host on television that I have ever seen, and he shouldn't be locked up in Los Angeles. Then he sent me a copy of the letter, and on the bottom there was this P.S. that said, John, I hope I did not cost you your job, by calling you smart, because I don't think smart is in vogue in America these days. Imagine that. He said that in 1970. What would he be saying today? Now, I wasn't smart enough to have Mark Lane on as a guest to talk to him about his terrific book. It just never occurred to me. But when I accidentally picked up Jim Garrison's A Heritage of Stone in Edmund's bookstore and began reading it, I stood there for 4 hours transfixed. I was learning stuff I never heard on the mainstream media. Here he had to take Time Life to the Supreme Court to get the Zapruder film. A forensic pathologist called at the trial who said there was no autopsy. They were stopped by guys in uniform, and then on and on and on. I stood there for 4 hours and read the entire book. My God, what a story. So really excited. The next morning I call information in New Orleans, get the DA's office, and I call. And this bass baritone answered the phone. And I said, could I speak to Mr. Garrison, please? And the voice says, this is he. Beautiful voice. I get all excited. Oh, Mr. Garrison, my name is John Barbour, and I'm hosting this morning show in Los Angeles, and it's live, and it's 90 minutes long, and I just finished reading your book, Heritage of Stone. And he said, oh, John, you must be the other one. I only sold 2. How could you not love a guy like that? The truth is, it was a bestseller. And I said, I'd love for you to come on the show. I will interview you for half an hour. Then we will open the phones, and they will be packed. There are just thousands and thousands of people who will call in. And then he said, no, you won't. And I said, what do you mean, no, I won't? He said, John, they are not going to allow you to have me on your show under any circumstances. Oh, yes, they will. I just won my first Emmy. You will. And then he interrupted me and says, oh, you planning on winning a few more? How could you not love that guy? So we chatted for a half an hour and laughed for a half an hour. Once in a while spoke about Shakespeare, of all things, and he decided to come on the show. So we booked the airlines, we booked the hotel, and after we had done that, I was fired. Now, I didn't think it had anything to do with my booking Jim Garrison, even though he warned me. I just thought this was show business, and you have a job for a week, you have a job for 13 weeks. That's just show business. And John McMahon gave me a 2-week notice, and I announced right away that I had been fired and that I would be replaced. In that 2-week period, a women's group went to every mall in Southern California and got 5,000 names on a petition to keep me on the air, plus there were hundreds and hundreds of letters. And they were all dumped on John McMahon's desk. So I went in to see him, and I said, John, I know that you don't care for me, and truthfully, I do not care for you, but that's got nothing to do with what we're trying to do in television and what you're trying to do here, which is to increase ratings. And Bob Irvine thinks that his 6 o'clock news ratings would improve if I got to do my reviews Monday, Wednesday, and Friday there, and then the public would not be too angry at you for firing me. And he said, fuck the public, they don't hire you, and you are through. I was not through at Los Angeles Magazine, fortunately, and then Channel 11 hired me to do the reviews Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I was thrilled to be there because it was there that Mort Saul did these magnificent shows about Jim Garrison, and he had been an investigator for Mr. Garrison for years. And then he was, of course, finally canceled, but there I was. And while there, Tom Brokaw saw me and recommended me to KNBC in Los Angeles, where they hired me as their resident critic at large, and I won Emmys 3 consecutive years in a row. It was also here that I created the concept for real people. My office was next to the teletype machines, and I'd go and read the incoming stories, and the dangerous ones were the ones that said not for broadcast. And the first one that I saw was Stripper for God. And I found about 20 more just as engaging as that and created the concept for Real People. So while I was mulling around how to sell that, I get a call from George Slaughter. They are doing a revival of Laugh-In, and George wants me to come on as their resident critic at large and one of the writers. He says there will be no permanent host, and one of our first hosts is going to be Frank Sinatra. So I went there, and it ended up that Frank Sinatra only used the jokes that I wrote. And then when the show was canceled, he came over to me, poked me in the chest, and said, "John, you and I are going to be friends for a long time because you're going to write a lot of my stuff for me." And then he got a copy of my album, It's Tough to Be White, and wrote me this fantastic note about it. That note is up on my wall, and it's also in my book. A little while later, he hosted The Tonight Show. I was the first one he called to do a stand-up. After the show, I get a phone call from Mr. Garrison, and he is chuckling. He said, "John, I didn't know you could do that kind of stuff. That was really good. Do you mind if I borrow some of the lines?" I said, "Not at all." He said, "My favorite was, I guess, a straight line, but it got a huge applause, was that Watergate was something that might be on the brink of turning America into democracy." And he said he just loved that, and a couple of others. We chatted for a while. Mostly he wanted to chat about Watergate because he mentioned to me a number of the names that were involved with Watergate, that were involved with the murder of John Kennedy. I mean, it was spellbinding just to listen to him. Then after that phone call, I get a call from Mr. Sinatra. He said, "John, can you meet me at my offices tomorrow at Formosa Studios?" I was there on time, actually early. I'm never late for anything. And he said, "John, how would you like to come on the road with me as my opening act for 8 months, and I will pay you 10 times the amount that you're making now as a critic?" And I said, "Mr. Sinatra." He said, "Francis." I said, "Francis, I don't think I could do that." He said, "Why not? You'd be making $3,500 a week. You're only making $350 a week now locally. You will get some of the national attention I think you deserve." And I said, "I can't do that because I don't want to be an absentee father to my son." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "When I was 6, sir, my father deserted us, and the pain was excruciating. I am never going to inflict that kind of pain on my son, so I will accept the $350 a week from KNBC and take him happily to his junior golf tournaments." Sinatra almost got tears in his eyes and reached over the table with both hands and grabbed my hand. And he said, "John, I promise you one day you and I are going to be doing something, and I never break a promise." Well, I left there almost with tears in my eyes because here's the greatest force in entertainment saying he wants to do something with me. But I never got to get any more $350 checks from KNBC. I was making that $350 a week, and I was responsible for 10% of the viewership, as was our weather girl, Kelly Lang, who was getting $2,000 a week. So I went to Irv Savchek, the news director, and asked for another $50 for a Monday and Wednesday and Friday. That's $150 only. And he said no. So I had no choice but to quit. And I thought, oh my God, my career is going the same way as Jim Garrison's case. So I go home, and there's my wife sitting talking to Chris Hayward, who is my son's godfather. He is the fellow that is now producing Barney Miller and saved that show from cancellation with his brilliant writing. And he said to me, he said, "John, I've been mulling over that thing you were talking to me about Real People. Danny Arnold has a contract at ABC to develop some new stuff, and he cannot come up with anything. So why don't Sarita and I go in there and see what we can do? So the following day, they go in to see Danny Arnold, and within 10 minutes, they have a deal for me to go there for 13 weeks to create my concept for a reality television show at $1,000 a week, and I'm going to call it National Graffiti. That's a combination of National Enquirer and that great Universal movie, American Graffiti. So I write 5 scripts. I go out and I shoot four stories, register it all with the Writers Guild, and then Danny arranges an interview with me with Maury Gelman at the Daily Variety, and I tell Maury that this Canadian dropout is going to change the face of American television with what I call the entertainment of reality. Then Danny sends me over to see Lou Ehrlich, who's the nighttime program chief at ABC, and he doesn't understand the show, and he asked me to explain it. Will anybody watch this real people thing? And I said, you'd be surprised, because my co-host is going to be Richie Pryor. And he says, like hell he is, that is not going to get on ABC. He is never getting on this network, and you as a critic only mean shit. And Danny Arnold is king, and the only reason we're even talking to you now is because Danny Arnold wants to proceed with this thing in which I have absolutely no interest. So we go ahead and shoot the pilot, and we're assigned 2 actors by Danny and Lou Ehrlich that are just god-awful in the studio. But the pieces that I'd gone around the country to shoot were an absolute smash with the audience. So after it's all over and the audience clears out, I'm on stage with Lou Ehrlich and Danny Arnold, and I say to Danny, you told me I had creative control of this thing. And Lou, you don't think I'm worth shit anyway in television. So why don't you guys get out of my way and just leave me alone? And so Danny says, well, you're all alone because you're fired. And so there I was, out on the street again, like Willie Nelson, on the road again. So I went around to about 10 of the leading producers in town who also didn't understand quite the concept of the show, but they loved the pieces that they saw. And I went back home and had an epiphany. I was 46 years of age. I stood across the street from my little bungalow where my son and my wife were, and I realized I'm never going to be the next Jack Barr. I am never going to be a star. I am never going to get a show like Real People on the air. And I literally gave it up. And it was one of the most peaceful, wonderful moments in my whole life. The longing for ambition were replaced by the lightness of happiness. Oh, I go into the house to hug my wife, to hug my son, get a job as a comedy writer, and the phone rings. And it's Digby Wolfe. Digby Wolfe was the actual creator of Laugh-In. And he said, John, I have a deal at Westinghouse to develop new shows. There we go again, new shows. And he said, I know you were under contract with Westinghouse years ago. Merv Griffin's recommendation to replace him as the host of his Westinghouse show until they gave it to David Frost. So they'll probably be happy that they will be dealing with you again. So why don't you come to my office and bring whatever you have for me to look at? I go to his office, which is directly across from George Slaughter's. And I'm sitting on a sofa outside waiting for him to get off the phone when George opens his office, sees me, comes over and hugs me. And hello, John, how are you? My God, come on in. I said, I'm waiting for Digby. He said, never mind, Digby, come on in. So I go inside and he said, I'm sorry you're not having any luck at ABC with your project about real people or with Danny Arnold. And I said, c'est la vie. He said, listen, I have a contract at NBC to do 4 specials. City Folk Against Country Folk, city music against country music. And I said, George, that's perfect for you with your short attention span. And he said, how would you like to do your show here? What do you mean? I said. He said, I got a call yesterday morning from Freddie Silverman, who said, George, can you do a show about real people? And I said, well, let me see. And so, John, do you want to do your show here? And I said, are you kidding me? He said, yes, you'll get 4 specials. I said, will we call it National Graffiti? He said, no, we're going to call it Real People because I want Freddie Silverman to think he's smart. Well, I must tell you, George Slaughter is smart. Now a word about George Slaughter. George Slaughter was the Jerry Jones of television. He owned the team, but he didn't know how to play the game. I was the quarterback. And for the 3 years that I was the lead writer on this show and the producer of this show, we did more good for this country than 60 Minutes did in 30 years. We got the Missing Children's Act passed for John Walsh. We got a presidential citation passed for the Navajo Code Talkers. And a story I did about a lonely professor whose son was murdered 1 week into Vietnam and then built a memorial to that son on a lonely hilltop in New Mexico. When I did that story, it played a major role in getting the actual Vietnam Memorial Wall built in Washington, D.C. That was the kind of impact and audience that this show had. Half of every set in this country was tuned in to Real People. And the more popular it became, the more George Slaughter did not want the public to know, or the industry to know, that he had nothing to do with creating the show, but had everything to do with ruining it. Because now in the second year, when it's a monster hit, he hires a 12-year-old Peter Billingsley to be a co-host, and we almost get into a fist fight. And of course I would be outmatched because he used to be a bouncer at Ciro's. Then Freddie Silverman calls him and gives him an order for 13 shows. He wants George to create a show that was like a ripoff of Network, and it was to be called Speak Up America. It was so god-awful. One critic after the first show said, it's Throw Up America. Of course, George runs to me now, even though we weren't speaking much, and says, could you help me, because otherwise this show is going to be canceled. And I said, George, listen, I got to protect this show, Real People, from you, otherwise it's going to be canceled. Now he's not speaking to me at all. Then one day I read on page 13 of the LA Times that the House Select Committee has discovered that 4 shots have been fired in Dealey Plaza when they find a dicta belt of a motorcycle officer. So I call Mr. Garrison immediately, and I say, well, Mr. Garrison, I just read this. Do you feel vindicated? And in that magnificent voice, he said, John, I feel like a blind man who's gotten a very small trophy in a very dark room. Only I know I got it. I said, well, now, Mr. Garrison, we're going to come down there and we're going to tell your story. He said, John, I haven't spoken about this case since Clay Shaw 10 years ago, but I will welcome you with open heart and open arms. So we go down there, and on September 5th, 1981, I put him on camera for 3.5 hours, even though we talked to him another 8 hours when he doesn't want to be on camera. And it was like talking to Themis, the Greek god of justice. There is so much material. When we get back home, it has to be a 2-parter. So in the first part, it opens up with Mr. Garrison and that beautiful voice and those large bulging eyes saying, Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination. He was not on the 6th floor and did not fire a shot. There's a gasp from the audience and then some applause. Then when the segment was over, there was massive applause. Naturally, it had to be a 2-parter. So I then put together the second part. When I had interviewed him, I asked him how many shooters there were, and he said, John, probably 3 teams of 2 or even 3 people. Since this was a major kill, they might have a third person who's on a phone. He said 2 are behind the picket fence, 1 at the Deltex building, but nobody on the 6th floor of the book depository. Then I said to him, well, how many people do you think actually knew that President Kennedy would not come out of Dallas alive? And he said, John, it's on a need-to-know basis. And then he runs down those who need to know. And he finally says, about 32 in total. Anyway, I edit the piece together. And you couldn't get into the studio. Nobody could get into the studio. There were lines to get in to see part 2 of Jim Garrison. Now, I didn't go to the studio because I was now turning my bungalow into a huge Swiss chalet for my wife and my son, and we were renting a house on Whipple Avenue, and that's where we sat to watch the show. So when it comes on, and it's time for Mr. Garrison to be interviewed by Marjo Gortner, and Marjo Gortner gets to the question, Mr. Garrison, how many shooters were there in Dallas? Mr. Garrison says, 32. Without my knowing it, George Slaughter had gone down at midnight the night before with Donna Cantor, who was a producer for me on that show, and re-edited it so that Jim would look like a fool, and told Donna if she called me, she would be fired. And my phone rings, and it's George Slaughter cackling like Hillary Clinton over how they murdered Gaddafi. And he says, we just gave Garrison what he deserved. He's an idiot. And I screamed at him, yo, you're an idiot, you're an idiot. Now, accidentally, I had recorded him on an answering machine, so it was all there. He was gloating over what he did. So I hung up and I called Mr. Garrison immediately, and I was sobbing and apologizing deeply. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And I was begging him to sue Slaughter and NBC. He would own them. And he said, John, softly, we love your show. And if I sued everybody who libeled me, I would never see my family, or I would never see my DA's office. Just send us a couple of Real People t-shirts. The next day, I went into the office screaming out of my mind at George Slaughter and at Donna Cantor, who was in total tears. And that ended Real People for me almost immediately. Now, the show ran for another 2 years because Slaughter had gotten a pay-or-play contract for 2 years before he fired me. But they canceled the show about 3 weeks after I had been fired. The day I was fired from Real People, I was making $20,000 an hour, not including reruns. And of course, when we were doing the show, my wife and I thought, like 60 Minutes, this could go on forever. And she said, you know, when we finish building this house, we'll be able to set aside some money to help Mr. Garrison. It's not the money that I missed doing the show. It was keeping people happy. That's what I love to do. It was in the 80s now, when I still got to do work that really made me happy. I did 2 pilots, one for Fox, one for CBS, and I was doing with Real News what I once did with Real People, and one of the shows was hosted by Greg Kinnear. I did a special with Ernie Kovacs. I did 3 shows of my own, one which was syndicated for 26 weeks. I did a show in Canada, and I guess most important, Jim McGinn at Bristol Myers got me 2 weeks late night on ABC called The Barbour Report. And that show did so well in those 2 weeks against David Letterman that Jim McGinn went to ABC and said, listen, we would like to expand John Barbour to an hour live on ABC late night. It doesn't cost you a nickel. Bristol Myers will pay for it. And they said to Jim, no way. John Barbour is just too damn controversial. So that left me a lot of time now to spend with my son on the golf course until 1992. It was in 1992 that Oliver Stone announced he was going to do a movie called JFK based on Jim Garrison's book On the Trail of the Assassins. I was thrilled because now I had 3.5 hours of the real Jim Garrison and I could make a documentary. And I was inspired by Oliver Stone because when he made Salvador, one of the best political movies ever made in this country, in order to finish it, he had to mortgage his home. So inspired by that, I would sell my home to get the $200,000 to make my film. But I knew nothing about films or how to promote them, so I called my friend Freddie Weintraub. Freddie was the guy that brought Bruce Lee to Warner Brothers. He is the guy that brought Woodstock to Warner Brothers. So when he saw my 3.5 hours, he said, "My God, John, you have the political Woodstock. You will make a fortune, the real Jim Garrison following Kevin Costner." So we went out and we made the film. At the first screenings of the film, it got absolutely rave reviews, so we got a contract to sell DVDs by the thousands. And I announced the first monies that come in from the DVDs are going to go to build a scholarship for Mr. Garrison at Tulane University. And I got a 3-word note from Oliver Stone that said, "Count me in." But I never saw a nickel of any of that money from the DVDs. It all went into Freddie's account. And then without telling me, he sold it to Cinemax for a one-time screening for an amazing amount of money that also went into his bank account. And I got a call from a couple of members of the Academy, and they said, "John, what are you doing, you idiot?" And I said, "What did I do?" "You sold that thing to Cinemax, and that denies you a chance at a slam dunk Oscar." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "If you sell a movie that's up for an Oscar, you're disqualified by selling it to television." Wow, that was a bit of a heartbreak. And then it won the San Sebastian Film Festival Award, so I thought with that it would certainly get a film distributor. But it did not. There was nothing I could do with it. So I put it up for free on my YouTube channel, where it's had over 1 million hits. Jim Garrison's daughter Elizabeth told me that while he was on his sickbed, her father got to see and absolutely loved the film before he died. And ironically, he died the day it won San Sebastian. She called me a week later to say now they were embroiled in a lawsuit against Oliver Stone and Warner Brothers to get 10% of the profits of the movie JFK. Showbiz! I did not get another chance to help Mr. Garrison for a while, and it happened again by accident. And that was on the 50th anniversary. I read that Bobby Kennedy Jr. in an interview in Texas in an opera house said that his father did not believe that the Warren Commission was right. He believed that the CIA murdered his brother. So immediately I called George Knapp, a very close friend here, who had salvaged my film by talking about it often on Sunday night Coast to Coast, which he magnificently hosts. And I said, "George, if I can get Bobby here and run the film, would you interview him before I run the film? And would $5,000 cover your fee?" He said, "God, John, no, that's historic. I would do that for nothing." So I called Sean Lawton at the Kepler Agency, who is the speaker's agent for Bobby and currently a friend of mine on Facebook. He talks to Bobby, and he finds out that Bobby might agree to do it for $25,000. So I said, "Great, $10,000 in advance and $15,000 afterwards." So I called the school. The school is thrilled. Greenspun School of Broadcasting says they will give me absolutely everything. So we set it all up. Also, what they are going to do is they're going to give me a list of 1,200 people who will stand in line to see this interview. Once it's all set up the day before, he cancels. The school did not want to waste the facility or the screening of the film and asked me what I could do. And I said, I think I have a way of salvaging that. So I got Joan Mellon, Dick Russell, and Jim Mars, paid them all quite a fortune, and paid all the fees to have them come out here. We would screen the film in front of a group of students. Afterwards, there would be a question and an answer. Of course, I didn't think that these three, as good as they are, could follow the very sad ending of that film. But they were magnificent. We turned it into a video called The Last Word on the Assassination. I told them they should take their act to Broadway. And of course, without Bobby, there was no sale. So again, I put that on Facebook, where it had thousands of hits. And to Bobby Jr., I sent an FU note, which you can read in detail in my book. And that brings me to today. Last year, when I was a feature speaker at Capper at the invitation of Dr. Cyril Weck, whom I deeply admire and still do, I said to him, Dr. Weck, I hate to remind you of this, but you're 89 years of age, but you're the only one with the panache, with the credentials and the personality that could gather 20,000 people on November 22nd, 2023, to knock on the doors of the Justice Department and open that cold case. And if you were to organize such a march, then the likes of David Talbot and James Douglas would get off their very comfortable couches and with their thousands of followers join you. It would be a media event that could not be ignored by the news. There you are pounding on the door while 30,000 people sing to you, Happy 90th birthday, Dr. Cyril Wecht. When can we start? And he said, I can't do anything, John. And I said, why not? And he said, because I have professional obligations that year. And I say to myself, whatever happened to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country? When I first put the American media up for $2, my son said to me, Dad, that's worth $10. Why don't you put it up for that much? And I said, Christopher, it says everything that Oliver Stone says in his movie. It backs him up 100%. So I am sure when it's up there, he will recommend to his millions of followers that they buy it. It's a real Jim Garrison, and we'll have enough money for a scholarship for Jim. But that did not happen. Was I disappointed? Not in the least. What he did instead, Oliver, he made James Douglas a millionaire again by recommending his book, The Unspeakable. It's a book that's almost unreadable. You don't learn much that is very, very new. It's certainly not as good as Joan Mellon's books or Jim Garrison's books. It takes 2.5 weeks to read. It costs $58. My film only takes 2 hours and 10 minutes to watch and only costs $2. And am I disappointed that none of these people like me at all? Absolutely not. Am I disappointed that they ignored Jim Garrison all the time? Absolutely not, because what they are now is just hucksters. They are merchants of merchandise about the murder of John F. Kennedy. Nothing more. And today they are nothing more than what Hamlet said are words, words, words. And words are absolutely meaningless. As Hamlet also said, words are a comforting distraction, but meaningless without action. Does it bother me that even though in my film I recommended all of their work because it's absolutely fantastic and you'll learn a whole lot about the case reading about it, just wonderful work that they do. But not one of them recommends our film on their site. Does that bother me? Not in the least. They don't disappoint me at all. I will tell you now, the one disappointment I had in 90 years. Because history will prove Jim's story and our film will outlast every one of these single books and films. Now I will get to the one disappointment in my 90 years. My greatest disappointment was actually heartbreaking. It was a sudden, unexpected loss of the friendship of Frank Sinatra. Of course, since I was interested in the murder of John Kennedy, I was also interested in the murder of his brother. And it was obvious from the autopsy by Thomas Noguchi that Sirhan had nothing to do with the shooting of Robert, that he was definitely shot from behind, and that is seen clearly in the autopsy. So Godfrey Isaacs and myself formed a committee to try to retain Thomas Noguchi as the independent coroner of Los Angeles County, because the police department and the media and everyone else was trying to get rid of him. We were very successful. We were fighting also in front of the city hall. We were getting great audiences and great hearings. But all of a sudden, because Thomas Noguchi would not change that autopsy report, there was another autopsy report that he would not alter, and that was the one on actor Bill Holden. Actor Bill Holden, when he died by falling in his condominium in Santa Monica and hitting his head on a coffee table and bleeding to death, the LA Times said he had a heart attack, and that was it. But when Noguchi did the autopsy, he said there was excessive alcohol in his blood. He fell and tripped and hit his head on the corner of the glass table and bled to death. So what happens now? Bill Holden was one of Frank Sinatra's closest friends, and he was outraged that Noguchi would say such a thing publicly about such a Hollywood icon. And he gathered together every single star he could in that town to form a committee to oust Thomas Noguchi. And of course, Frank Sinatra was going to be a whole lot more successful than John Barbour and Godfrey Isaacs. And he never spoke to me again. That broke my heart. Now, that was a little disappointing. And sometimes when people get down, as I was down then, a little down now, they turn to God, Santa Claus for adults, or they read the Bible, or the Koran, or the Talmud, which are written by the religious Hans Christian Andersen. But not for me. I would go back to George Carlin. I would go back to Bill Hicks. I would go back to Jonathan Winters. I'd go back to Robin Williams. Lenny Bruce, with whom I spent a last year before he died. And also I would go back to Gore Vidal, who was one of the one percenters, who was very witty about the corruption of this country. But I never got a laugh anymore. Nothing seemed funny anymore in this country. So I went deeper and deeper, 400 years back, to Jim Garrison's favorite writer, William Shakespeare. It's 1960, I'm 27 years of age, and I go to England to track down my father, and I do find him. So he comes down in a chauffeur-driven limousine and picks me up at my boarding house, and we're driving back to Scotland. It's very, very awkward, as you can imagine. And finally, he says to me, "What have you been up to?" And I say, looking for you. And that ended our conversation. It got very still after that. But all I got to thinking as I was going up there was, holy God, here I am, dead broke. And I'm now in a limousine on my way to Scotland with a very rich man. And now maybe I'm going to live that lush life. So we stop in front of this 3-story fantastic building that says Angus Barbour McLaren Advertising Agency. And he says to me, before we go and meet my wife, I would love you to come upstairs and watch me record a commercial that is due tomorrow. Do you mind? And I said, oh my God, not at all. I'd really love to see that. So we go upstairs into these lush big offices, and there's a staff about 8 or 10 there. He sits me off to the side, and up on the screen comes this sort of dancing Pillsbury doughboy. He is off to the side, and he takes a microphone, and in this beautiful lyric baritone voice starts to sing the voice of this cookie. And I am in disbelief. And I start to think to myself, oh my God, did he give up leaving his wife and 3 children to go and fight the Germans and lose half a stomach, then get the Order of the British Empire, then to come up here and become very rich and famous in the advertising business and sing to a goddamn cookie? I said nothing, but he could see the disdain on my face. And when it was over, he said pointedly, you don't like what I do you? I couldn't answer him. He said, I think I was a terrible father then, and I'm probably going to be a terrible father now. I do not think you and I are meant to be together. I will give you £100, and my chauffeur will take you back to your boarding room. And I said, no, I will take a train, thank you. I don't want him. Thank you very much. I am thrilled, though, that I did get to meet you. So I took the train, and it was one of the luckiest days of my life, because on the train, going to London, I'm reading a newspaper, and it says, wanted actors for the Castle Theatre in Farnham, Surrey. So I get off, and I'm there in time to take auditions, and I win, so I become part of this terrific company, and I am there for over 6 months doing a new play every 2 weeks. I just absolutely loved it. Then at the end of the season, they have a fundraiser. And in this fundraiser, every actor or actress gets to do a short favorite scene from a movie or a play. And of course, what I decided to do is I wanted to do Hamlet. When I was 8 years of age was the first time that I heard Hamlet. That was John Barrymore. Now, at that age, I didn't know what the words were, but they captivated me. There was something about the musicality of it, the poetry of it. And ever since then, 12 of the most famous English-speaking Hamlets I listened to or I watched, all the way up through John Gielgud or Laurence Olivier or Richard Burton, my very, very favorite, because of that magnificent voice. But when I got older, I thought, while I enjoyed listening to them, I always thought they had the interpretation wrong. And by that, I mean that Shakespeare was writing for the theater. He was writing for every man. He was writing about life. A lot of scholars and actors think that To Be or Not to Be, which are the 6 greatest words ever spoken or written in the English language, was about suicide. It is not, because that's dismissed in the very first act. This entire monologue is about how to start your life and do something that you need to do. And in Hamlet's case, he didn't know how to get started to seek revenge on his uncle for murdering his father. Now, a half a dozen people I knew in Hollywood who were great great things they wanted to do, when they sat around thinking about what it is they wanted to do, they never internalized it. They really got angry at themselves for not being able to start. We are all that way. We get upset at ourselves. We don't internalize. And the problem with all of these actors, the greatest of them, is they all just internalize to be or not to be. And the worst of these was, of course, Laurence Olivier, because he doesn't even speak it. It's just a voiceover, for God's sake. It's like Richard III. He is so badly deformed he can't have any fun with women. So he comes out and he walks directly toward the audience and he says, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York." And then he goes on to tell them that they're going to see the greatest villain who ever lived, and they loved it. That is what Shakespeare meant by this monologue. He did not mean for Hamlet to sit on a goddamn sofa or sit on a chair and mope to themselves, but go down in front of that audience and, like Sinatra singing "That's Life," he was supposed to tell them what life is all about. Well, I go back. Now the director says to me, "Okay, you said you wanted to be last, John?" And I said, "Yes, please." And I'm going to do that soliloquy from Shakespeare. And then I said, "But before I do, I want to go down and talk to the audience to tell them what I'm going to do." And he said, "Okay." So I go down and I say to the audience what I've just said to you. There were a lot of boos. There were a lot of people shaking their head. There were a lot of people going, "Oh my God," like that. And I could well understand that, especially when I talked about their idol, Laurence Olivier. So I go back behind the curtain and gesture to the director to tell him he can introduce me. I'm behind the curtain. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the last actor tonight from Canada doing the most famous monologue from Hamlet, I think." And the audience starts to laugh. Well, I walk down there, and I walk back and forth, just looking at them, just staring at them, as peaceful as could be, until they all got quiet. And then I started walking again and pointing at them before I began to speak. Now, I can't walk back and forth here because you're the only one here. So I'm going to look directly into the camera and do it. And here it is. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them, to die, to sleep no more. And by a sleep, we say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, the spurns that merit of the unworthy take when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. But with a bare bodkin, who would fartles bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus, conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment in this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. I was one of the few people who got a standing ovation, and also I got applause at the end of one line, and you know what that line was. And the laws delay, because in any society, in any civilization, in any century where they allow lawyers to live, look, if politicians have term limit, there should be trial limits. Anyway, afterwards, my director was hired by the Bristol Old Vic, and he invited me and a couple of other actors to join him, and I turned him down, and he said, "John, no, come with me. It looks like you love to do this stuff." And I said, "I do, but I cannot do it anymore." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "I simply cannot escape into reality with make-believe. In a play, you know the ending. In real life, you create your own ending. In a play, you're only testing your memory. In real life, you're testing your mind. And I want to test my mind and create my own ending." So then I was off to the railroad station with empty pockets and full heart, and off to California and America, my geographical G-spot, where I am still creating my own ending. For 53 years, I have tried to do something for Jim Garrison. I have run out of the doing. As John Kennedy said in 1960 when he took office, it is now time to pass the torch to the next generation. At the height of the Civil War, there was a 17-year-old boy who was mortally wounded and knew he was going to die and was afraid he was going to go to hell, so he called for a minister to bless him. The minister came over and he said, "Father, you know, I never got in my entire life anything from God that I prayed for, but he gave me everything I needed. I could be that 17-year-old boy. So I wish you goodbye where parting is such sweet sorrow. I say to each and every one of you, I wish you lots of love, lots of luck, and most of all, live your life as one with meaning." Adios.